We are now going on directly to the sixth session of the final session, themed Indian foreign policy, the next 7 decades. The session will be chaired by Ambassador D.B. Venkatesh Varma, former ambassador to Spain and the Russian Federation. We will be having speakers. The distinguished panelist is Professor Ajay Darshan Behera, Academy of International Studies, Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi. We have our second speaker, Professor Chintamani Mahapatra, founder and honorary chairman of Kalinga Institute of Indo-Pacific Studies. And we will again have Zorawar Daulet Singh, fellow Center for Policy Research, New Delhi, as our distinguished panelists. I will hand over the proceedings to Ambassador Varma. Thank you, sir.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon, namaskar to everyone. Firstly, let me convey my very warm appreciation and gratitude to Director General of ICWA, Ambassador Vijay Singh and a team. This has been a fantastic collection of experts and scholars and diplomats on a very important theme as we celebrate the 75th anniversary of our independence. And it's been a fantastic collection of, and I must say that if at all proof is required, the previous panel, the depth of discussion was absolutely extraordinary, and which is of course makes it easier for this last panel, which is actually a forward-looking panel, which makes it much easier to take the discussion forward. And I'm very happy that we have three colleagues who have joined us: Professor Behera, Professor Chintamani Mahapatra, and Dr. Zorawar Daulet Singh. Absolutely delighted. So to continue with the theme, the theme of optimism, the theme of ambition, the theme of scope that was there in the last session. Let me take this forward, pose a few broad issues, and we'll take up the comments and the discussion after the three panel speakers have spoken. The first is the last 75 years marks an extraordinary journey for our republic, which makes it special, but also imposes on us the responsibility to see how we can chart out to our nation in a very troubled world for the next 75 years. Now, when we are having a discussion of this nature that will take forward our vision, vision has to be combined with ambition, and ambition has to be backed up by capability. And this is a thing that we constantly need to keep in mind. I would say that if the first 30, 40 years of our independence, we were batting, figuratively speaking, on the back foot. In the last 10, 15 years, we have, I think, come to we are batting now at the crease. I would imagine that in the next decade, few decades going forward, looking forward to the next 75 years, we will increasingly be capable and willing to go outside our crease, to pick up the ball and sort of score runs on our initiative, on our proactive initiative. I think a small glimpse of that was seen in the Prime Minister's address to the Global South Summit that was held just last week, preparatory for the G20 summit that we will be hosting later this year. And India's approach, and particularly Prime Minister Modi's speech, I think brings together in a very special way, I must say, both the vision, our ambition, what we want to do, our proactive proposals, and the scope and depth of India's engagement. In addition to being the G20 chair, I mean, we have certain responsibilities come with any chair. I think it's quite extraordinary that India has taken the initiative to reach out to the global south to get a sense of where they stand, their perception of their issues, of their regional issues, their perception of the global issues, and see how we can dovetail this and synchronize this and bring a convergence for the global conversation that we'll have with the 19 most powerful countries in the world, along with the European Union making it G20 in September this year. Now, the areas in which India is wanting to engage on, and that is there clearly in Prime Minister's speech, gives a range of issues, which is from debt to economic development, impact of the pandemic, to terrorism, and also to the global issues of war and peace and security and international security. So we are, in a sense, covering the entire scope of the agenda. We are also, in a sense, reaching out to the global south. I don't think the intention is to make it as a trade union, but to represent their views with the global north, so to speak, in the G7 and the G20 more broadly, which combines the old world in the G7, the emerging multipolarity which is represented in the other members of the G20, and India's bridge with both the world that has gone by or going by and the world that is to emerge. So there is an extraordinary level of positioning in India's foreign policy. And I think this is a good indication of how we intend to go forward. And there's a sense of optimism, a sense of ambition. I think these are very, very powerful indicators. Of course, this is not an easy task. This is a very troubled world. In many ways, this is a world that is far more troubled than the world we are familiar with, which is the end of the Cold War. And definitely it goes back to some of the great grave uncertainties and the lack of easy options as we had seen during the Cold War period. But I think Indian foreign policy has shown both the depth, the maturity, and the adaptability to how to address these issues going forward. Let me frame three questions that our panelists, I request our panelists to dwell on as we look forward as the theme of our panel, looking forward to the next 75 years. Please feel free to be as ambitious and as visionary as possible. We belong to a very proud country, and as citizens and as experts and as people we have, and we should never fall short of vision and ambition. But I think at the same time, we should also be cognizant of realism and pragmatism, and I would request you to bring that in your perspectives as well. So the 3 points that I wish to make going forward in the next 75 years. The first project is India's completion of its sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Republic of India. Let us not forget that in the last 75 years, this has been an incomplete project. And we are still challenged on our borders. Borders are challenged in various ways in terms of legality, in terms of illegal occupation, in terms of a military buildup. But also our borders are challenged by the fact there is not unanimous, universal, international recognition of where our borders lie. So this is a project that we inherit from the last 75 years, but we should definitely correct and put down to our republic sooner rather than later in the coming period. The second is to bring development in its comprehensive form. The Chinese may talk about comprehensive national power. We should talk about comprehensive national development. Development of our people in terms of their well-being, economically, technologically, culturally, socially, and most important, civilizationally. It is not only bringing the Indian Republic onto the world stage in a manner that is consistent with the wishes of our people, which is primarily now to bring up the values of economic development, the fruits of economic development to the last man, but also to use economic development to increase our our spiritual well-being and to be truthful to our civilizational values. Technology will play an extremely important role in the transformational aspect of India in this second aspect, and I would request all of you, the panelists, to engage in this. The third is finding India's true and well-deserved place in the international system and the global order. And I don't mean this just merely in terms of economic or military power, but what we bring to the table in taking forward humanity's vision and well-being as a whole. And we will be judged. There is already an expectation that India will engage on this. But I think going forward, this will be, of course, on the third point, the world is pretty complicated, to say the least. There is emerging multipolarity, but it is contested multipolarity. Multipolarity gives us more space, which we welcome, which we should use with greater responsibility. But multipolarity is also contested, and therefore the importance of protecting our sovereignty and territorial integrity through adequate military deterrence and nuclear deterrence is, of course, cannot be overestimated. Of course, we need to bring a balance between our military build-up and our economic resources that are available for this. But also engagement, diplomacy as a force multiplier, not just in a power sense, but in a spatial sense, in an ideation sense in terms of ideas for the world, but also a vision for how the world should transition to not just power conflict between the big powers, which we are all aware of, but also in terms of the values for humanity as a whole. So I'm setting a fairly high bar, but it is also a bar that allows all the three panelists to sort of, in a sense, expand on these or other views that they have. I will request each one of them to confine their remarks, their initial remarks, to about 7 to 10 minutes, and then we can have a discussion. I would request our respected Professor Ajay Behera to start off the discussion, and then we'll take it up from there. Professor Chintamani Mahapatra will be next. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Varma. I have to thank Ambassador Vijay Thakur Singh for giving me this opportunity. It's an honor to be part of this very serious engagement on Indian foreign policy. I think, Ambassador Varma, this is probably the most difficult session, thinking about the future 77 decades. The problem with vision is that it has to be matched to reality. And reality is something that, the material factors of reality is something which we will not be very clear about the future. There'll be so many imponderables, there'll be so many variables which will come in the way of analysis. But I think I want to begin with, a forecast by the Goldman Sachs, because it gives us some, how the world will look like in the next 7 decades or so. So this Goldman Sachs projection, and I do not want to call it a forecast, it's a projection. I mean, this can change for various reasons. The Goldman Sachs projection says that in 2075, India is going to overtake the United States and become the second largest economy in the world. By 2075, the 3 largest economies in the world are going to be China with about $58 trillion GDP, India about $53 trillion GDP, and the US roughly about 52, 53. Now, this is a very significant transformation if it actually does happen. We also have figures for the changes that's going to happen by about 2050, where India's GDP is gaining substantially, about $37 trillion. Now, what we have to derive from this is the whole power structure in the national system is going to significantly change. So which means in the next 30, 40 years, we are seeing some significant changes in the power structure, and the 5 biggest countries, or let me put it, the six biggest economies in the world in 2075 are going to be China, India, US, Indonesia, and Nigeria. And to flag it off, Pakistan is going to be the 6th largest economy in the world in 2075. Now, this means, I mean, we have to derive certain conclusions from this, which means, I mean, are we going to reach this stage with, Asia being volatile or, Asia being unstable? Clearly, the major powers in the international system by the time are 3 of 4 major Asian countries. I mean, it's known that that the Asia is the center of power, or the shift of power towards Asia. But my point is that do we assume from this that Asia is going to be relatively peaceful to be able to achieve those kind of GDP by 2075? What does it say about the flashpoints in Asia, which means we are again assuming that it's unlikely that either the Taiwan Straits or the Korean Peninsula going to kind of see any overt conflict. The question then arises, given the fact that China is the leading economic power, but we also have to recognize that the difference in the GDP between these 3-4 countries is not significant. China is 58 trillion, India is 53, and the US about 52, which means that there's no substantial difference, or a huge difference in the GDPs of these countries, which goes to say that they kind of evenly matched in terms of the GDP. But I would still say that the US and the European powers will continue to be technological giants. That's something which I do not know whether China and India are going to be able to match that. And in terms of knowledge production, also it is the West that is still going to be dominating, given the kind of investments they have into research and development. So, but what is clear, and again, this is subject to any kind of imponderables that might come about. I mean, we've just gone through the pandemic. We've also right now seeing the continuation of the Ukraine war. Anything is possible, but the projections suggest the evolution of a multipolar world. I do not see bipolarity coming back into the international system in any significant way in the coming years, if these projections are to be accepted. And secondly, the multipolar world order is also unlikely to be dominated by China. I don't think so. A globalized world order is conducive for dominance by any hegemonic power. So what we probably will see is a kind of a post-hegemonic world order. No country or no power would be able to dominate the international system as has been there in the past. And we also have seen examples from European history that multipolar Europe also has been the best in terms of preservation of peace in Europe. And the emergence of a multipolar world order in which the significant changes in the architecture of power structure in the international system is essentially conducive for the development of I mean, from the India's point of view, which also means that there's something right that we have been doing with our foreign policy, whether we call it a grand strategy or not, the strategy of non-alignment, which essentially ensured certain amount of strategic autonomy to India, which India will continue to exercise that strategic autonomy. It has also been kind of, one of those countries in the world which has managed contradictions between other powers also in the international system, whether it was during the non-alignment period or even now. What's probably been unique about India, and which has been recognized by others, that we have been able to create relations of friends with countries on opposing sides. So, which means essentially that how do we manage a relationship with the United States and China, even if there is a certain degree of bipolarity emerging between these two powers. In terms of our relationship with the other emerging powers or the countries in Southeast Asia, we are in a sweet spot there. Our relationship with countries in West Asia, again, if we see, we have managed a relationship with Israel and Egypt. We have managed a relationship with, Iran and Saudi Arabia. So India that way has had this ability to deal with, all kinds of power, even if, and it's not been kind of dragged into, their issues. I think the problem lies in South Asia. As an emerging power in the international system, and this is where I think some of the, the three questions that Ambassador Varma also raised, we'll have to touch on the first question also, where it's linked up to the question of Pakistan. How do we deal with Pakistan? South Asia is not going to be a problem. The smaller countries, the neighbors, we'll be able to take them along with us. But how do we deal with Pakistan? Pakistan, which, recently, just a couple of days back, there was an article by Air Vice Marshal Sajjad Chaudhry, which has got a lot of media attention in India, where he clearly recognizes that the gap between India and Pakistan has become unbridgeable, and there's a need for recalibration of Pakistan's policy. Now, one doesn't know whether the Pakistanis have really seen the writing on the wall. I mean, these kind of observations one has come across earlier. One also sees a lot of confusion in Pakistani policy as to what do they want. Unfortunately, because of Pakistani recalcitrance, the intra-regional trade in South Asia is only about $28 billion. That's very, very insignificant. And if these projections are to be true, or I do not see how these projections are going to become correct, even while South Asia is lagging behind. Pakistan relates to this question also about India's nation building, whether Indian territorial integrity, whether eventually recognition of India's sovereignty over disputed territories, etc. On this is a tough question, Ambassador Varma, because I do not know, as still a third world country, where India might remain a nation in the making. It may not ever become a nation in that sense. And I remember also some scholar, a couple of years back, had written, about the rise of India, and said that this is going to be a third world major power. So the tag still might remain, because the characteristics of what a developed nation or a major power should be, with all its weaknesses, internal weaknesses that India has. So I think we might still be in that stage where we may not be able to assert ourselves, where we will continue to have domestic challenges on various counts. And that is the reason why I think it's important that India focuses much more internally or domestically. Because by the end of it, the purpose of Indian foreign policy is essential to ensure security and development. And the focus, I think, should remain largely on the question of in India's development. In what ways Indian foreign policy or the changing geopolitics in the national system and how India adapts to that change needs to be translated into the benefit or benefit of all Indians. The Goldman Sachs projection also for 2075, unfortunately, per capita GDP of India is projected as 19th in the world. The European powers are still the top 5 are still the US, Canada, Germany, Japan, and India is 19th in that list. So if $52 trillion does not translate into adequate per capita GDP growth, where the human resources are not developed, all Indians do not live a dignified life, which I think should be essentially the goal of the major transformations that we are seeing in Indian foreign policy. So 2 points I would like to say before I end. One, I think that India needs to become a knowledge producer. In the last session, Zorawar mentioned about a geopolitical school, which is important. But we also have to build up a narrative of vocabulary which essentially projects to the world the moral values to which Indian foreign policy works. We haven't been able to sell the ideas of non-alignment, even when we were essentially, a grand strategy was non-alignment, is not acceptable to the world. And essentially, the reason was that, we didn't have the power. Now we have the power or the rising power. We need investments. And this is where I think, our investments need to be much more focused on creating those institutions which can contribute to knowledge production. And therefore, a country like India, with its growing GDP, needs to significantly enhance its investments into education. The budget, which is roughly about 3%, and projections that the new education policy will invest about 6%. I think that's crucial. That is going to be very, very crucial to the kind of power India is going to be in the future. A high GDP growth rate need not necessarily mean India has all the instruments of power, or what one can call as comprehensive development of power. Ambassador Varma was trying to raise a question: what is the kind of comprehensive development we in research? So with those few points, I would like to conclude, Ambassador Varma. Thank you very much for giving me that opportunity.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Behera. That was a very clear enunciation of the primacy, in fact, the priority for getting our economic seniors right going forward, because that will be absolutely critical. Professor Chintamani Mahapatra has extraordinarily contributed in the past to our engagement with the United States and understanding the United States going forward. And amongst our relations with the big powers, our relations with the United States will be absolutely critical. I mean, it's one of the most critical relationships that we have developed. We've come a long way in the last 30, 40 years through various periods of tension, of conflict, of contradictions in that. Many of them have been, in a sense, removed. I think the India-US nuclear deal was important in a sense of removing obstacles to achieving the full potential of the India-US nuclear deal. But that is already 15 years ago. Confronted with the changing world in terms of geopolitics, in confronted with the fact that we need to put in everything that is necessary to ensure our high growth rates. That is something that Dr. Behera also mentioned. How do you locate the India-US relationship as the US's own relationship with China, with Europe, with Russia also is evolving? Professor Chintamani, Mahapatra, please.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Varma. Let me at the outset express my gratefulness to ICWA, particularly DG Ambassador Bijay Thakur Singh, for giving me an opportunity to share my thoughts in such an important conference. I have listened to all the presentations since yesterday by the distinguished speakers, and I have learned a lot. Most of them have deliberated upon various dimensions of Indian foreign policy in last 75 years. This particular session is really special. It is aimed at looking at the next 70 years. It is easy to analyze what has happened, but difficult to predict what will happen. Yet, it is necessary to talk about the future. Not to predict the future, but to set the goals and work towards achieving those goals. I have been a student of international relations for 44 years. And whatever I'm going to say just now is basically the dream of a student of international relations. My dream is a set of aspirations that India should have. That is in my view. Now, it will all be speculations, yet doing so would be worthwhile. In fact, one can speculate about the past as well. For example, if World War I and World War II would not have taken place, if Japan would not have suffered the nuclear attack, if colonialism would have continued, what would have been the alternative history of the world? It is very difficult to imagine. So is predicting the future. Even then, let me make a few observations about the future. Number one, rise and fall are inevitable for individuals, for families, for societies, and even nation states. Some countries, some civilizations rise and fall, whereas many, many countries do not even get a chance to rise enough, let alone fall. We all know that the former Soviet Union was nothing but an experiment that worked only for about 70 years, and then it disintegrated. What was the United States until the Europeans and subsequently the Asians and others went to settle in that country, in that continent? The United States emerged as a world power in late 19th century and has by and large remained on the top of the global order at least since the end of the World War II. It's almost about a century. We have seen colonial empires at work and then their dissipation. India, in that sense, is well known as a continuing civilization for about 50 centuries. Although India as a modern nation state is about 7.5 decades old. Now, when I dream about the future, I also think in the following way. What was India at its birth as an independent country? And where has it reached today? By any standard, India has performed better in its demographic experiments, economic growth, demographic empowerment, military strength, and even playing a significant role in international affairs. It is admitted on all hands that India's potentials are enormous, and it has to go a long way to realize those potentials. More than 7 decades ago, India had mass poverty and mass illiteracy. Today, the story is different. India was backward in agriculture and industrial activities. Today, the scene is so different. India was a victim of external aggression quite a few times during the first few decades of its independent existence. Now, it is able to deter external powers from launching attacks. India was a leader of the developing countries and played a key role in NAM that consisted of more than 100 nations. Now, the non-aligned movement is not, in a way, non-existent, but a very innovative group of countries known as the G20 is playing a role in global political economy, and India is a respectable member of the G20 and current chairperson of this grooming. India's return as an independent, autonomous, economically dynamic, politically resilient, militarily stronger nation has been possible through about 75 years of evolution, and we have talked about it since yesterday. This experience of India would certainly enable the country to plan a future where it will be an acceptable and effective player in global affairs through the next 70 years, as per the theme of this session. What should India do to make it happen? To start with, setting the goals. In my view, in my dream, India in the next 25 years, that is a century after its independence, should work diligently to become one of the global superpowers. First, India should not look for a role model to play the leadership role in world affairs. All the current and erstwhile powerful nations and their role may be studied, should be studied for knowledge, not for imitating them. That means India should aspire to play a unique role, befitting its status, its civilizational background, and its knowledge system in coming years and decades. Secondly, India's leadership should aim at democratization of global decision making, as against the oligarchic method prevailing today. Third, Indian scholars, in my view, should do deep research into why empires and powerful nations declined and provide inputs to the policymakers to make India a superpower and sustain India's global role for a long haul. Let's learn from the experiences of others. Fourth, India should invest sufficiently in developing comprehensive national power to protect its interest against all kinds of wildcard developments that may take place in the world. The future is full of unpredictables and there will be wildcard developments, but the academics and the researchers and the policymakers should think about, imagine the wildcard developments and try to find out solutions in case things go wrong. Fifth, India as a superpower should aim at acquiring a capability to be the principal donor in the world, a security provider, and offer a model of good governance to the world. Sixth, India should be one of the leading nations to combat climate change, deal with natural disasters, prevent terrorist activities, and deter aggression in international relations. What should be done to achieve all these dreams and goals? A. While priority should be given to science, technology, and innovation, strengthening social sciences to promote national unity, equitable economic growth, social cohesion, and good governance at all levels are extremely important. B. Maintaining the balance. A balanced approach to national security and internal security needs to be adopted because we know in the past from Indian history how it is the internal enemies which invited the external forces and we got colonized. C. The expansion of disruptive technologies are going to pose major challenges to India's inclusive growth and social stability. Envisioning the challenges and setting up appropriate mechanisms to provide social security to people need to be a priority in public policy formulations and in implementation. Formulating a new set of foreign policy goals and national security strategy are also very, very important. India's engagements with the rest of the world should not be confined, in my view, to immediate neighborhood and extended neighborhood, or for that matter, to Indo-Pacific. India needs to formulate a comprehensive and integrated vision to engage with the entire world. Indo-Pacific concept may be extended to include even the Atlantic and should not be confined to only the littoral countries. E, there is no doubt that India today engages itself with Africa, Latin America, Europe, and North America. But Indian foreign policy goals need to be integrated and comprehensive, not fragmented one. While, next point, while current limitations of India have to be overcome, and I'm aware of all those, the future needs to be shaped with newer goals and strategies. India's political economy is affected today by what happens in different parts of the world. In my dream, I see that after 7 decades, India's domestic dynamism should influence the globe and not just the other way around. Next point, India needs to cogitate now to innovate its diplomatic strategies and methodologies and train its diplomatic personnel accordingly. Ministry of External Affairs need further modernization and appropriate innovation, especially in the selection and training of diplomats. The future diplomats should be specialists and have deeper knowledge of foreign countries, their societies, economies, internal strengths and weaknesses. They should be well versed in the languages of the countries they will be sent to represent Mother India. If India will seek to be a force for global good, which India should, what is imperative is developing self-reliance, Atmanirbharta, on energy, technology, weapons, and resource exploitation. India will most likely remain the most populous country in the world in next 7 decades, with a large geography, considerable natural resources, and of course, the huge human capital that we have. In conclusion, I think the future planning may be done at 3 levels: immediate, mid-term, and long-term goals. I have some thoughts about the near-term developments that may take place, and that will address some of the questions raised by Ambassador Burma. I think rise of Germany and Japan are going to take place in the near future, further rise as independent international actors. The United States and China may actually continue to checkmate each other by following a policy of mutual containment. Russia will be weakened after the Ukraine war. The European Union and ASEAN and similar regional organizations may just struggle along. The United Kingdom and France may become more assertive individual actors and less dependent on the United States in the near future. India thus may have to align carefully and cautiously with all these multiple actors. India's rise has been peaceful, and so it should also remain peaceful to make it an attractive superpower for other countries in the future. Role of public diplomacy and shaping opinion about India in other countries to keep it an attractive nation and Vishwaguru is actually important. These are my dreams. And to realize all these dreams, my country, India, has to stay awake. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Chintamani, Mahapatra, for a broad overview of the risks in the international system, but also very specific points that you have mentioned, detailing over almost 10 points, what India should take into account in having a balanced approach to both internal development and external policy. That was very useful. Let's turn to Dr. Zorawar Daulet Singh, who's very acute, very perceptive analyst of big power relations in the international system. I think the general assessment is that in the long term, things will become easier for India. In the near term, which is the next decade, I think things will be a little more complicated than we are normally used to. And how this will reflect in some of the concepts in our foreign policy, for example, multi-alignment, strategic autonomy, the new cooperative frameworks, platforms that we are working with, the Quad, the Indo-Pacific, the I2U2. India's contributions to the international discourse, starting with the International Yoga Day, our notion of lifestyle component of addressing climate change, to address the consumption dimension of it, I mentioned this, the South Dialogue, the Global South Summit that recently took place. Obviously, Indian foreign policy concepts are also in a churn. What do you think are the considerations that we should keep in mind to take India forward while avoiding the inevitable risks that will lie in place? But you could weave these questions into the larger presentation that you'll be about to make. How do we make a balance between continental and maritime strategy? We tend to swing from one extreme to another. How do we have the interests of our very large Indian diaspora, which is one of the largest in the world for any country? How do we look after their well-being in a world that is in quite a bit of turmoil? Zorawar, on to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ambassador Varma. So I just thought I'd make a somewhat of a briefer intervention here and perhaps leave a little more space for discussion. I think the essence of what we are discussing is that we have an ongoing power transition that's occurring at multiple levels of the international system, and it entails certain challenges to make that transformation complete. It can never really be complete from one order to another. We're sort of in that inflection point between two orders. And I'll sort of suggest where are some of the areas that India has sort of a credible posture and its own interest to play that role to advance this agenda going forward. The agenda towards a multi-civilization, multipolar, a more equitable geoeconomic system. So to begin with, of course, why are we even discussing this transformation or this power transition? It's been occurring because of a redistribution of economic, technological, and military power. The diffusion has been occurring for the past several decades. There was an imbalance in the 1990s where you had, and the early 2000s, the unipolar phase had kind of concentrated and a preponderant amount of power in the United States and in its collective alliance. That kind of has faded away. The relative shifts have been occurring. Of course, the Ukraine conflict has been called as the first conflict in a multipolar world. The sources of that, of course, are not in only linked to that particular geography. There is a bigger struggle between a unipolar world and a multipolar world, and it's manifesting in Ukraine. And we see the protagonists from both sides in that conflict are openly calling, one side is calling to preserve the post-Cold War settlement, which was this period of the 1990s and 2000s, and the other side, Russia, and perhaps even many non-Western states who are silently watching, are looking to see what will follow. Regardless of how that crisis unfolds and concludes, there certainly is no going back to the post-Cold War era. If we look back to that unipolar world, I think it's important to understand that it had its the illusion of stability and a universalism that made it somewhat easier for the rising powers to operate. The reason for that was you really had one system of rules that you really were asked to either you choose to plug into that system, and there were no real alternatives. The resistance to that system, ironically, as we now can see from the past several years, certainly in politics in Western societies, was there was disillusionment of a system that was providing unequal gains to the West, but yet they felt the cost of governing that system was becoming far too onerous. So I think the first sort of crack on the block of the unipolar world ironically comes from within the West, but it also comes from several non-Western powers, a whole range of them: China, India, Iran, Indonesia. I mean, you have a whole range of other states in different levels are dissatisfied with this period of which is not providing them an opportunity to move up the value chain, so to speak. So collectively, that world order has become unsustainable. So what do we do now? We have this multipolar world. The problem arises is that we are lacking a commonly acceptable framework for the rules, norms, and institutions. So you have this normative framework and the key institutions which are still lagging behind. The power realities are more balanced. Even there's an economic balance of power. There's even a military balance of power. There's even a civilizational balance. But the legacy institutions are so overbearing that that's where India's focus should be in the coming decade. So the three areas that I would suggest where India's foreign policy can sort of make a mark and should be actively thinking about. First is in the security front. I won't dwell too much on this, but basically for reasons of political geography, India, which is thankfully, and it's perhaps its geopolitical fortune, is outside the main theaters of great power confrontations and the key potential flashpoints. Whether we look at what's happening in the Western Pacific, in East Asia, Northeast Asia, Europe, India is not at the front and center of those particular great power sort of flashpoints. We have, of course, our own security challenges on our frontiers, but they're different from those. And I think that gives India somewhat of an advantage to articulate security ideas for the broader region that are somewhat more inclusive, not one-sided or zero-sum, more sustainable. I think the aim here for India's foreign policy would not be to interfere in these other disputes that are occurring beyond India's region, but certainly to see or support a transition to a multipolar world that is as less destabilizing as possible. Because our interests lie in arresting a further fragmentation of the international system. Return to a spheres of influence world is not in our interests because we can't go it alone for a variety of our developmental needs. We still need access to multiple power centers. So, of course, it's not in our hands to completely prevent a return to, let's say, a 19th century style of a international system, but certainly we want interdependence to continue to prevail. So this is where the second sort of area that India's foreign policy, and I think here where the chair mentioned this idea of comprehensive national development, I think becoming more of a conscious driver than simply comprehensive national power, though of course they're both very, very interlinked. India's economic and developmental requirements in the coming decades are going to be the highest of any single state in the international system, given the size of our population and the metrics of targets that we've set to reach. So India has a big role to play in how this new form of globalization, interdependence, whether it applies to trade, development, industrialization, is now reoriented towards a domestic renewal framework. Recall that the unipolar world had a more neoliberal economic framework operating, countries plugged in for growth, but that growth could be highly imbalanced, unsustainable, and not necessarily advance your comprehensive national development of power. So I think many in the global south are seeking a framework for globalization that sort of allows them to enhance domestic capacities and an opportunity to upgrade their industrial, scientific, technological basis while continuing to engage with the global economy. So we are talking of a very different form of economic interdependence to the largely asymmetric or one-sided options that were available in the 1990s and 2000s, which gave the illusion of supernormal growth even to the emerging markets, but they were highly imbalanced. Finally, a very important area for India's foreign policy to engage with is the idea of what will be the rules and framework of access to key global public goods. So multipolarity by definition means there can be no monopoly on the regulation and access to what we could call key global public goods like strategic commodities, digital networks, or financial networks. I think we've seen in the recent conflict in Europe and even the decades leading up to it, and the arbitrarily a single state can be turned off or plugged out or shut out of that system. So I think renewing that confidence in a more plural network that allows countries to hedge against geopolitical risks. So we would like a digital system or a financial system that is not dominated or controlled by a single actor that can turn it off for you. So I think these are some of the areas that if we are going to seek a new form of globalization, the underlying institutions of the commons, whether it's the financial system or the digital system, or even the way sanctions are sort of deployed internationally. I think it's very, very important for that confidence to be renewed, because if we do not have faith in those commons, we're going to see a fragmentation of a number of supply chains across industries, which will start going towards more national, sub-regional concentrations. Again, that's not something that will entirely suit India, because we still need a period of, let's say, a decade and a half to move up the value chain in many of these critical technologies, which require us to have partnerships with, let's say, in Asia, Europe, and North America. So I'll perhaps close there and hand it back to you. So,
thank you very much, Dr. Zorawar, Daulet Singh. That very perceptive comments, and this, I think the totality of the three panelists have made very extensive comments, but very useful comments, and they take us to the notion that India's opportunities will only increase. Development, economic development is priority. Economic development also requires external engagement. External engagement will have to be taking into account the risks of a transforming world, and India should be engaged in the transformation rather than be a passive recipient to the transformation forces that are. We have 10 minutes left. I have already received a couple of questions on the chat box. I will summarize the questions and pose it all together, and I'll give last opening comments turn to all the three panelists so that they can respond, also taking into account the questions that have been asked. The one set of questions relate to the importance of military diplomacy by India, especially in the neighborhood, but also the importance of having a national security strategy. I think that is unexceptionable, but I think the point needs to be emphasized that coherence and consistency and internal understanding of how India wants to go forward and engage with the outside world, I think is very important. The second set of issues, I think this is particularly addressed to Professor Chintamani Mahapatra. How do you see India stand with respect to the I2U2, GCC, Israel, Iran? The third set of questions is how do we deal with our neighborhood? I mean, I think the sense of the question is, don't we need to get the neighborhood policy right and operational before we are fully free to deal with the broader world? There are different views on this, but let me put these questions forward. But let me start by, in the reverse order. I'll ask Dr. Zorawar Singh to speak first. Chintamani Mahapatra last, and the last closing comments can come from Dr. Behera. Zorawar, up to you.
Thank you. So, very briefly, I would sort of offer a something on the neighborhood, the immediate neighborhood. I think you had raised the idea of this continental maritime. In my earlier interventions, I hadn't gotten deeply to what is our immediate geopolitical environment. So I think it's important to recognize, while we have these debates on which is the particular arena that India's foreign policy or security policy should emphasize on, which should be its dominant identity, I think it's becoming clear that you need the maritime arena or the maritime spaces, which are the commons, to access multiple other more dynamic economic regions. But your core, let's say, classical geopolitical considerations of homeland security, frontier security, ultimately rests on the stability and integrity of your continental frontiers. We do not yet see a great power on our maritime periphery providing that level of a existential threat. but we do see it on our frontiers. On our western front, we see a state that is ideologically, venomously being created. And on the north, we have a somewhat of a different security problem, a legacy of perhaps a century of an unresolved frontier. So a tension will always be on that front. So a maritime role cannot substitute what we do there. It can complement it, and it should have a more of an economic basis. In fact, going back to my previous presentation, I think the connections that we had before the British arrived on the scene or the Portuguese arrived on the scene, you had these vast interlinkages across regions, right from the West Asia all the way to the South China Sea. You had this Indian Ocean that was spread out, and you had enormous interdependence with even primitive technologies a millennia ago. I think restoring those linkages are perhaps more important than thinking about, let's say, a joint naval patrol around the Taiwan Straits, right? Those kind of wacky ideas, I think, need to be set aside and focusing on a different type of interdependence. And I think that's where India's foreign policy has been pursuing, whether it's the Look East, Far East, all the way up to Vladivostok, maybe the Arctic routes that will open up, the North-South corridor. We're trying to reclaim all these different connections, because we ultimately are still a landlocked state, right? Because of partition, because of complete a block on the north. So I think we have to keep endeavoring towards that. On this idea of what can we do on our immediate neighborhood, I think India's developmental requirements have become so massive and formidable that I think just having a policy based on providing some kind of dominant role in South Asia by itself or the subcontinent will simply not provide what we're looking for. So we do need to have a bigger global posture when it comes to all those kinds of links that we need to bring in, and keeping an eye. So I think that's where we can help our neighbors while we build interdependence with, let's say, East Asia or the West. Can those fruits of that engagement also filter out to our smaller neighbors? So I think that's where you can sort of gain. So it's an open regionalism, but always linked to some kind of transformation happening in the neighborhood.
Thank you. Chintamani, Mahapatra, especially on the Gulf, our relations with the Gulf.
Sir, you have to unmute yourself, sir.
Sorry. I'll make a few points. Number one, as far as India's engagement with West Asia, particularly with Israel, with Palestine, with GCC member countries, with Iran, are concerned, I think the Modi government has done extremely well. Pakistan was trying to play the Islamic card in the Kashmir issue for a long time, and we have successfully dealt with them and told them that if India can have good relationship with Saudi Arabia and Iran at the same time, they should also wake up and not take sides on issues of South Asia. And particularly, given that India's dependence on West Asian energy resources are going to be crucial for the foreseeable future, our diplomacy is very crucial there. And of course, millions of people are living in that part of the world, and we need technology from Israel. So I gave all very high marks to the Modi government for engaging West Asia very well. Number two, on the neighborhood, I have just two very brief points. Number one is Pakistan. At the moment, Pakistan is getting riper by the day for some kind of implosion, whether it is economic crisis, whether it is social, when the terror group still existing there, and the kind of relationship they have with Afghanistan, it is in a very dangerous phase. So in my view, India should think about two issues: how to prevent implosion of Pakistan, how to contribute towards that, and number two, in case it implodes, how to deal with the ramifications. Number two, as far as China is concerned, I'm more worried about China's domestic issues today because partly because of the COVID-19, the way they have been handling COVID-19 and its impact on the economy, their real estate situation is very bad. The energy crisis is there. The moment they stopped buying coal from Australia, many factories were shut down. Then you have the banking crisis in so many Chinese cities, people are coming out to the street. So whenever a country like China will have internal problem, they will always go to external areas. And that is why we should be aware about our LAC more and more in the future. As far as the United States is concerned, my last point, which Ambassador Burma asked me to say something on this. I think the Indo-US relationship has matured to an extent where even differences on certain critical issues such as Ukraine is not going to derail the relationship between India and the United States, because the stakes are very high in the Indo-Pacific. The Americans understand it, India understands it, and we are not taking any step which will oppose the US, which will in a way negate the American interest. That is why I think this matured relationship is a good thing, and deep into the future, India and the US will remain strategic partners. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Behera, please.
Yeah, thank you. I think I'll just add to the comments which I've already made, fairly comprehensively covered on the questions. Regarding the neighborhood, I think, our growth has not been inhibited by the fact that, we were not able to get, regional cooperation going in South Asia. All of us know the reason for that. So the question is basically that do we really have to take South Asia along? It would depend on the South Asian countries. And obviously, I mean, what's important here is, what Pakistan is, going to do. With the reference to Air Vice Marshal Shehzad's article, I mean, it's very clearly pointing out the irrelevance of Pakistan in the contemporary world. I mean, this is probably a recognition that many Pakistanis have. But the power structure is such in Pakistan that it's very difficult for us to envisage a complete turnaround of policy in Pakistan. But at the same time, I mean, I'm not too sure whether, as, Professor Chintamani was predicting an implosion. I do not know. I don't think the world is ready for an implosion in Pakistan, and everyone knows why. Will the national community sit back and watch a country falling apart, a country which has nuclear weapons? So I think there's something that we need to also kind of keep in mind, whatever is happening. It's very unlikely that Pakistan will not ride out this instability, economic problems that it's going through. Given the fact also that I mean, Goldman Sachs is projecting that Pakistan is going to be the sixth biggest economy by 2075, suggests, I mean, if everything goes right, that there is immense potential of economic development even in Pakistan. I mean, it does have certain drivers for economic growth. I think the polity, the military, the bureaucracy, the political system just simply has not got its act right, and it has to realize, that they're simply being left behind. And I do not know. Maybe there may be a transition, a transformation within Pakistan, and this is where I think we need to keep our, options open. If Pakistan changes, it's good for us. If it does not change, and we simply have to do what we have to do, leaving it behind, I mean, we don't have to be bothered about, except for the fact that the ability of the country to create problems for us. So I think it's not all that important that, that we have to take the entire neighborhood with us. We have done sufficient overtures to them. Our power, India's rising power will, I think it's imperative that the other smaller neighbors will realize the benefit of engaging with India and not try to, create problems. One cannot be categorically sure about, what Pakistan is going to do. And the signals are very confusing. I mean, this TV interview by Shehbaz Sharif, the Prime Minister, again yesterday or day before. I mean, if they want to stick to that position of negotiations, obviously we're not heading anywhere on that. So I'll just leave, with those remarks. Thank you very much, Ambassador Varma.
Yeah, Dr. Behera, thank you very much. I'd like to thank all the three panelists, Dr. Zorawar Daulet Singh, Dr. Chintamani Mahapatra, Dr. Behera. This has been a very rich discussion, a very substantive discussion. We've covered a very wide range of issues. I think the general mood is one of optimism, of the importance of economic growth, India getting its act together on the economic side very much. India progressing in its determined engagement with the outside world. The outside world will be complicated. We want to be sensible, but we also are dependent on the sensibility of other countries, particularly troublesome neighbors as Pakistan and China. China's rise is a factor that we'll have to contend with. But we have a lot of friends in the world, a lot of goodwill in the world. And I think the task of our foreign policy going forward the next 75 years is to look after the interests of our people, but also find for India a place that it deserves, what its history, what its civilization calls for, and what is expected of India in the larger international system. I think there's a lot of good going for India. We can look forward to one with optimism. I would very happily say that the best is yet to come. With this, I hand over the floor to the organizers, and let me thank Dr. Vijay Thakur Singh for this panel, but also more broadly the organizing this 2-day seminar, very substantive, and I think DG ICWA and ICWA as a whole deserves our very warm congratulations on a very, very good program. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Varma, for chairing this session. I will also thank panelists Professor Behera, Professor Mahapatra, and Zorawar Daulet Singh for contributing to this session. It was an enriching experience. I would now request Dr. Nivedita Ray, Director Research, Indian Council of World Affairs, to please deliver the vote of thanks. Over to you, Dr. Ray.
Distinguished panelists, participants, a very good afternoon. We now come to the end of this very productive and engaging virtual international seminar, which gave us a chance to indulge in a very interesting deliberations on Indian foreign policy as India celebrates 75 years of independence. It is my pleasure to propose a formal vote of thanks. At the outset, I will start by thanking DG ICWA Ambassador Vijay Thakur Singh for a very valuable thoughts and insights which he shared in the inaugural session, which actually set the tone and context for the seminar to deliberate on the evolution of Indian foreign policy, its challenges and achievements, its contribution to the regional and global discourse and in the last 7 decades, and its expected course in future. I would like to thank all our distinguished chairs for the 6 technical sessions that followed the inaugural, Ambassador Nalin Suri, Professor S. T. Muni, Ambassador Ashok Mukherjee, Dr. C. Rajamohan, Ambassador Pankaj Saran, and Ambassador D.B. Venkatesh Varma for steering the discussion and sharing with us a very insightful insights and observations on the theme. I would like to express our sincere thanks to all the eminent speakers from overseas and India for taking time out to participate in the seminars and share their very thought-provoking remarks which generated so much of debate and discussion. Our gratitude to all the participants who have joined us from different time zones and across the country for your active participation in the seminar and for your interesting questions which actually kept the discussion very lively. At ICWA, I take this opportunity to thank the ICWA team headed by Jay's ICWA, Ms. Tutan Kapoor Mahawar, for her directivity and support in the organization and conceptualization of this seminar, and the team, including the coordinator, colleagues at the research faculty, the IT, and the seminar section for ensuring a smooth running of this conference. With this, we come to the end of this very successful virtual seminar. Thank you all for once again for joining us and looking forward to your participation in our future programs. Thank you.
With this, we come to the end of the two-day international webinar. I would thank everyone for participating in the event, and we'll be looking forward for your support and cooperation in the future. Thank you all for your attention and cooperation. Have a very good day ahead. Thank you.